September 17, 1939, marked a dramatic escalation in the Second World War as the Soviet Union launched a surprise invasion of Poland from the east. This move, made in coordination with Nazi Germany under the terms of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sealed Poland's fate as a nation caught between two totalitarian powers. The Soviet invasion added a new dimension to the conflict, highlighting the ruthless realpolitik of the era and the tragic plight of the Polish state. The day was a turning point that revealed the limits of Allied commitments, reshaped global perceptions of the war, and set the stage for a prolonged and devastating conflict across Europe. The Soviet invasion. A calculated betrayal. In the early hours of September 17, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the eastern borders of Poland, advancing into a nation already reeling from the German blitzkrieg. The Red Army, numbering over 600,000 troops and supported by tanks and aircraft, moved swiftly across the border, meeting little organized resistance. The Soviet invasion was justified by Moscow under the pretext of protecting Belarusian and Ukrainian minorities within Poland, claiming the Polish state had effectively ceased to exist due to the German invasion. The reality, however, was starkly different. The Soviet move was a calculated act of aggression, coordinated with Nazi Germany as part of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed just weeks earlier on August 23. This agreement had secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with Poland slated for partition between the two powers. The Soviet invasion of Poland was thus the culmination of a cynical agreement between two of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century, each seeking to expand its territory and influence at the expense of weaker neighbors. The Polish government, caught entirely off guard, was already struggling to cope with the German invasion and was in no position to mount an effective defense against a second front. Polish forces in the east were poorly equipped, outnumbered, and had little means of communication with the main body of the army fighting in the west. The Red Army advanced rapidly, capturing towns and cities with minimal resistance. The speed and scale of the Soviet advance, combined with the surprise nature of the attack, left the Polish military in disarray. Polish resistance, a nation on its knees. For Poland, the Soviet invasion was a crushing blow. The country was already in a dire situation, with its forces heavily engaged in the west against the Germans and Warsaw under siege. The Polish government, led by President Ignacy Mościcki and Marshal Edward Rydz Śmigły, was forced to confront the grim reality that the nation could not withstand a two-front war against both Germany and the Soviet Union. On September 17th, the Polish High Command ordered a general retreat to the southeast, toward the Romanian border, where they hoped to regroup and continue the fight or, if necessary, cross into neutral Romania to seek asylum. This decision effectively marked the end of organized Polish resistance as a national army. Isolated units continued to resist both German and Soviet forces, but without a coordinated command structure, these efforts were ultimately futile. The Polish population, already suffering from the effects of the German invasion, now faced the prospect of a brutal Soviet occupation. In areas occupied by the Red Army, Soviet authorities quickly moved to establish control, disarming Polish units and detaining officers. Thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were arrested, and a wave of repression began that would see tens of thousands deported to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. For many Poles, the Soviet invasion was seen as an act of betrayal, compounding the sense of abandonment already felt by the lack of effective Allied intervention. German response: a deliberate division of Poland. In Berlin, the Soviet invasion was greeted with approval and satisfaction. The Nazi leadership, under Adolf Hitler, viewed the Soviet move as a confirmation of their strategic calculations and a vindication of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The division of Poland had been a central component of Hitler's strategy to avoid a two-front war while securing Germany's eastern flank. On September 17th, German forces continued their advance through Poland, meeting little organized resistance as the Polish army focused on retreating to the southeast. The Wehrmacht moved to consolidate its control over the territory allocated to Germany under the terms of the secret pact with the Soviets, capturing cities, disarming remaining Polish units, and establishing a harsh occupation regime. German propaganda continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary defensive action, emphasizing the swift successes of the Wehrmacht and portraying the campaign as a justified effort to protect Germany from external threats. The Nazi regime sought to maintain public support for the war and sustain morale among German troops, who were now preparing for the possibility of future operations elsewhere in Europe. Allied response: strategic paralysis and public outcry. The Soviet invasion of Poland on September 17th caught the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, off guard and further complicated their strategic calculus. Both nations had declared war on Germany following its invasion of Poland, but had made no similar declaration against the Soviet Union, reflecting the complex and often contradictory nature of their diplomatic and military strategies. In the United Kingdom, the government of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain faced a dilemma. While there was widespread condemnation of the Soviet invasion, there was no appetite for opening a new front against the Soviet Union, especially given the ongoing struggle against Nazi Germany. The British government was also acutely aware of the limitations of its military capabilities and the logistical challenges involved in launching an offensive in Eastern Europe. On September 17th, discussions within the British War Cabinet centered on how to respond to the Soviet move diplomatically without escalating the conflict further. Public opinion in Britain was increasingly critical of the government's perceived inaction, with many feeling that the Allies had abandoned Poland to its fate. The British press condemned the Soviet invasion, with newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph calling for a firmer stance against both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. However, the reality was that Britain was not prepared for a broader war against two major powers. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French army, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was in no position to intervene in Eastern Europe. The limited military actions in the Saar region had been more symbolic than substantive, reflecting the French military's cautious approach to engaging German forces directly. Many within France were growing increasingly frustrated with the government's strategy, which seemed to prioritize avoiding immediate conflict over actively supporting Poland. The failure of the Allies to take meaningful action in response to the Soviet invasion highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of repeating the catastrophic losses of World War I and were concerned about the readiness of their forces for a prolonged conflict. However, this cautious approach also meant that Poland, their ally, was effectively left to face the combined might of Germany and the Soviet Union alone. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and global realignments. The Soviet invasion of Poland and the subsequent division of the country between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union prompted strong reactions from the international community, leading many nations to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly evolving conflict. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 17th, discussions within the U.S. government focused on the possibility of expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash and carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 17th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 17th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the Soviet invasion with shock and condemnation, highlighting the plight of the Polish people and the perceived betrayal by the Soviet Union. Coverage emphasized the resilience of the Polish defenders and the need for national unity and readiness for a prolonged conflict. Editorials called for increased support for Poland and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde condemned the Soviet invasion and highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Poland. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media portrayed the Soviet invasion as a natural and justified consequence of the breakdown of the Polish state, emphasizing the mutual interests of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in stabilizing Eastern Europe. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military successes of both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, portraying the partition of Poland as a necessary step toward peace and security in the region. In the Soviet Union, state media presented the invasion as a defensive action to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 17, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked the effective end of its sovereignty, as the country was partitioned between two totalitarian powers. The Polish government's appeals for Allied support had gone unanswered, and the nation was left to face the harsh realities of occupation and repression. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the complexities of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still grappling with the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support Poland directly, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the Soviet invasion of Poland prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. Italy and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 17, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the Soviet invasion of Poland added a new dimension to the conflict and highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability. For the nations involved, it was a time of critical decisions and strategic positioning, as they sought to navigate a war that was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. For the people of Poland, it was a day of despair and betrayal, as their nation was torn apart by two powerful neighbors. The events of September 17th set the stage for a war that would reshape the political, social, and economic landscape of the 20th century, leaving an indelible mark on history.